Hi, my name's John. When I first started working on growth, I'd constantly hear that growth is data-driven. Growth is data-driven. But I had a hard time figuring out how exactly people were using data to help drive their growth strategy. You'd hear about A/B tests, but no one was talking about how you could use data to figure out what to work on or what to do next. So today I'm going to share with you a few of the ways I've learned how you can use data to help drive growth, and also some specific projects I've worked on that have been successful at the companies I've worked at driving growth. First, some quick background on myself. I worked at Shopkick as the lead for the growth engineering team for 3 years. And Shopkick was a mobile rewards app where you could collect points for visiting retailers like Target and Macy's, and then use those points to get gift cards later. I then joined Pinterest last year, and Pinterest, I'm sure most of you have heard of it, but it's a platform that helps users discover things they love and get inspired. And at Pinterest, I've been working primarily on growth on our mobile platforms. So the first metric I wanted to talk about today helps answer what is sometimes one of the hardest questions in growth, which is, where should you focus? I'm sure many of you here have dozens of ideas for different projects you could work on, touching from user acquisition to retention to engagement. But how do you figure out which of these areas you should be paying the most attention to and you should be focusing your time on? I'll share with you the process we use at Pinterest to help answer this question. But first, you need to understand the model behind it. In our model, we have 3 types of users. There's new users, there's monthly active users, and there's dormant users. And between each of these types, you have transitions. So a new user can churn out and become dormant. A dormant user can get resurrected and come back to your service and become a monthly active. And the way we use this is we track the number of users that make one of these transitions each week. And when you do that, you get a graph that looks like this. So you can see the top line, the purple line, is the number of dormant users that came back to the service. The bottom line, the orange line, is the number of monthly actives that churn out. And the way we use this is we use it to understand what are the factors that are driving our growth rate. So when you add up all the transitions, what you get is that thick black line in the middle, which is your net change in monthly active users. So when it's positive, that means you've grown your monthly active user base by that amount. And when it's negative, that means you have some serious issues because your user base is starting to shrink. And what we do is we look at the trend of this line, and especially when it starts to trend downwards, we use this graph to figure out where the problem area is and what we need to work on fixing. So for instance, if it was trending downwards and we see that more monthly actives are churning out, we know we need to focus on retention. Or if the new signups line was trending downwards, we know we need to focus on user acquisition. The transition we probably pay the most attention to, however, is activation. And activation is the process of getting a new user to stick around and become a monthly active user. And the reason we pay so much attention to it is because activation is critical for growth. Activation is your signal, especially for an early stage startup, on if you've reached product market fit. It's your signal on if your app is really providing value to your users. But how do you know if you have good activation? For this, we track a benchmark called retained MAUs. And what it is simply the percentage of new users that sign up that are still using your app a month later. And what you want to aim for is you want to aim for a retained MAU ratio of over 25%. Because anything less, you're going to have a very, very difficult time growing your service. Because for all the new users you get to sign up, you're only going to be able to hold on to a fraction of them. And for reference, I know at least a few years ago, Twitter had a retained MAU ratio of around 25%. That I think they've since improved it. Facebook, I've heard anecdotally, has a retained MAU ratio of around 80%. So if you fall in this range, you're probably in good company. But you still want to work on improving your activation rate, because any incremental improvement in activation just amplifies all your efforts on user acquisition. I'll share with you an example of one of the ways we improved our activation rates at Pinterest. So this is what our new user experience used to look like. After a user would sign up, we'd tell them how they could use Pinterest for discovery, we'd tell them about pinning and about boards. And what we would do is, after they completed this, we'd then dump all the users onto a feed of just the most popular items on Pinterest. And the growth team, we had a hypothesis that if we instead connected users with content they personally found engaging, we'd be able to increase our activation rates. So we built out a new flow where instead of showing a bunch of education, we simply asked users what were they interested in. Were you interested in camping? Or were you interested in motorcycles? And we used that information to construct what was hopefully a highly relevant, highly engaging feed, where once the user saw it, they could immediately start seeing the value Pinterest could provide to them. Because activation is all about communicating the value that your app provides to the user. But we still wanted to communicate some of the mechanics of how to use Pinterest. We wanted to still inform them about what boards were and what pins were, but without the text-heavy descriptions from before. So to do that, we built out what we called the guided first pin experience, where once you land on your feed, we guide you towards clicking on your first pin. From there, we guide you to clicking the Pin It button and get you on the way to creating your first pin and your first board. This experiment was able to help us significantly boost our activation rates. It was able to increase the rate at which new users pinned by over 20%, which was a huge gain for us, and ultimately is able to help us increase our number of monthly actives. So I spent a little bit of time talking about activation. I now wanted to spend some time talking about user acquisition. One of the best ways you can use data when working on user acquisition is to model out your user acquisition funnel. At Shopkick, incentivized invites were one of our primary user acquisition strategies. And this is an example of what one of our funnels would look like. We'd track the number of people that saw an invite prompt, how many of them sent an invite, how many invites did they send, and so on. And there's two key things I want to point out about the funnels we use. The first is that our funnels didn't end at signups. When you're working on growth, you want to make sure you're optimizing for the right thing. I'm sure many of you have heard of cases of startups dramatically growing their user base in a short amount of time just to have those numbers come crashing down later. And the reason that happens is because they got very, very good at user acquisition, but they weren't able to hold on to any of those users. So when you're working on user acquisition, it's critical you make sure you're optimizing for retained users that stick around and use your app. The second thing I want to point out is how we've segmented our funnels. So rather than just having one funnel that shows how invites work as a whole, we decided to segment by which prompt the user saw. And you can see, for instance, for the first use, it's responsible for generating a huge number of invites, but at the end of the funnel, it's not actually adding that many new users. Whereas the profile prompt generates fewer invites, but at the end of the funnel is getting you more users because it has a much better conversion rate. And so by breaking down metrics, you can start to really understand what's working for you and what's not. You can start to understand where the problem areas are and what you can do to fix them. So for instance, you might decide to work on optimizing invites by working on the first use conversion rate. Or you might decide that first use isn't really working for you and decide to work on the profile prompt and get more users to see that prompt. Another reason why funnels are so important is because they help you start to estimate out the impact that different experiments you're thinking of doing will have. I'll share with you a story from the early days of growth at Shopkick. Back then, the way we used to figure out what to work on was we'd get everyone in a room together, we'd brainstorm a bunch of ideas, have everyone vote on what their top picks were, and then we'd go work on whichever ones got the most votes. And we did this for several months, and we ran several experiments that looked great on paper. They all had good percentage increases. But after those several months, our user numbers hadn't budged at all. So going back and looking over the data to figure out why this was happening, what we realized was that even though all these experiments had great percentage increases, they weren't actually adding much to the bottom line. They had good percentage increases, but they weren't adding monthly active users. And so what we realized is, it sounds obvious in hindsight, but you have to prioritize projects based on ROI. And you have to use tools like the user acquisition funnel to help you model out what the ROI is on different projects. When you're an early stage startup, there's a huge opportunity cost associated with working on projects that don't move the needle. So you have to do your due diligence first, because due diligence is cheap, but engineering is expensive. So going back to invites at Shopkick, while I was there, we were able to grow the number of users we got from invites by over 500%. And I'll show you 3 of the projects that helped us get there. One of the first ones was changing the incentive. We used to have a small incentive for each user you invited. And we moved to a structure where you got a much larger, more appealing incentive, but you had to invite 3 users to get there. And what we saw was, A, it increased the percentage of people that invited at all because of the more appealing incentive. And B, people invited more users on average because they had to reach that minimum level of 3 people joining. And those 2 effects just compounded and helped us make a significant impact on invites as a growth strategy. Another project we did was adding a recommended friends section. So rather than making the user do a bunch of work to hunt through an alphabetical list and find who they wanted to invite, we tried to figure out who a user was close with and surface those people at the top of the list. Again, this helped us increase both invites sent per inviter and the percentage of people who invited. And another project that was successful for us was adding the ability to import contacts from other channels. So for instance, you could import contacts from Facebook or Gmail. And again, this was aimed at increasing the number of invites sent per inviter. And all these projects were very successful, but as we added more and more features to our invite flow, we had a harder and harder time figuring out where the problems were, where users were getting stuck. So to solve this, we took a page from Google Analytics Playbook and built out a behavior flow graph. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but what it shows is what pages a user landed on, what were the subsequent pages they went to, and what's the drop-off at each point. So we wrote a really simple script to generate a text-based version of this graph for our invite flow. And what we tracked was just what buttons users clicked on and what happened after they clicked. For instance, if we were looking at the Facebook import, if a user clicked on that, were they able to import successfully, or did they have a problem? Maybe they denied the permission. And we tracked the drop-off at each point. And this helped us uncover areas where users were encountering difficulties and having issues. And so we were able to identify the problems and fix them. Again, it comes down to breaking down metrics until you can see where the problems are and how you can fix them. The last piece of data I wanted to talk about today is how to analyze experiments. This is the experiment dashboard we use in-house at Pinterest. Each row is a metric, and each column is the change in user behavior that many days after encountering the experiment. And what makes this dashboard really useful, in my opinion, is the ability to segment your analysis. So you can see how an experiment performed amongst just men, or how it performed amongst just users in Japan. But the most useful way of segmentation that we found is segmenting by users' level of engagement. So we classify users into a few different levels of engagement. We have what we call core users that use the app multiple times a week. We have marginal users that use the app once or twice a month. We have new users, and there's a couple more. And what we've seen is experiments can have dramatically different impact on users of different levels of engagement. This experiment here is actually for one I ran recently, where if a user hadn't visited Pinterest in 10 days, we sent them a notification. And so sure enough, 10 days in, you can see the metrics jump up. And down near the bottom, you can see for weekly active users, is able to increase weekly actives by about 4%, which was great for us. But when you look at how it performed amongst marginal users, you can see the impact was much, much bigger. So for weekly actives, is able to increase weekly actives by about 13% for marginal users. And the reason the results don't look as dramatic when looking at all users is because often your user base becomes made up of these core users who are highly active, highly engaged, and it can be very difficult to take a highly active, highly engaged user and make them even more engaged. But it's much easier to influence the behavior of a low engaged user or a new user and get them to become more active on your service. And so sure enough, when we look at how this experiment performed amongst core users, you can see the results were much different. For core users, it had an impact on weekly actives by at most 1%. And I think the key takeaway here is that you have to look at how your experiments are performing amongst different segments of activity. Because if you don't, you might potentially make the mistake of thinking your experiment's broken and not working, or underestimate the impact of it, or even worse, end up making the wrong call and deciding not to ship it. Finally, to wrap up, I wanted to share with you an example that I think ties everything together and shows how you can use data to inform your growth strategy and have a really tangible impact on your growth trajectory. So at Pinterest, towards the end of last year, we were trying to figure out which area we wanted to focus on. We looked at our net MAU graph from the beginning, and we're happy with our activation rates and retention rates. So we decided this quarter, we're going to focus on user acquisition. And so we started brainstorming a bunch of projects on how we could go about improving acquisition. And we used tools like the user acquisition funnel to model out what the ROI on all those different projects were. We ended up zeroing in on improving our sign-up wall as being one of the highest leverage projects that we could work on. Here's what our old sign-up wall used to look like. One of the nice things was it was very simple, but it didn't really do a lot to tell you what Pinterest was about or why Pinterest was something that you would want to use. So we worked with our design team, and we came up with a new wall that centered around how you could use Pinterest for different use cases. And so here's what one variant looked like that talked about how you could use Pinterest for a hobby. We had other variants that talked about how you could use Pinterest for travel, for recipes, and for gardening. And when we launched this experiment, we used our experiment dashboard to see how these different use cases were resonating with different users. So for instance, did all these different use cases, did they resonate as much with men as they did with women? Did they resonate as much with users in Japan or Brazil as they did with users here in the US? And based on that, we were able to make further tweaks and really maximize the gains we got from this experiment. Ultimately, this new sign-up wall was able to help us increase our sign-up conversion rate by a double-digit percentage. And over the course of a year, that amounts to adding millions of new monthly active users to Pinterest, and was one of the most successful experiments we ever ran. And I think it's a great example of how you can use data to help inform your growth strategy and help drive a really tangible impact on your growth trajectory. That's it from me. I think I have time for some questions now. Okay. Yeah.
This is really interesting. So you said he, even though you don't know anything about whether this is a woman or a man, and then you put the name and then some information underneath that?
So we tested a few different versions of copy, such as having a specific person there, having a gender neutral term there. And we found that women didn't really mind having a non-gender neutral one, but obviously Pinterest tends to be female heavy, so for men it helped more men sign up when we said he. So for us, monthly active is just someone who visits the site or uses the mobile app. We have a bunch of other metrics that we track that track higher levels of engagement. For instance, another key metric we track is called works, which is weekly active repin or clicker, which tracks are they repinning something or clicking through on a pin. And we do track those metrics as well. But a lot of people also just browse Pinterest, so we wanted to sort of capture those types of users as well. Yeah.
So you talk about acquisition for the sign-up page, which is when people are like already on the page, right?
Mm-hmm.
Most of us don't have the Pinterest sort of traffic or the Dropbox sort of traffic. So how do we get to? Were there any tests you did to get more people actually to this page? Through better ways of sharing a pin or even like other channels?
Yeah, so one of our primary acquisition strategies at Pinterest is around content, so sharing content out to Facebook, getting people to share content to your friends. And I think what acquisition really comes down to is figuring out what it is you have that you can use to get your service in front of other people. So for instance, it might be you have users, and so you can get them to invite their friends. Or you might have like some currency that you can use to incentivize them to do that. For us, content is one of the primary things we have at Pinterest that we can use to get Pinterest out in front of other people. All right, I'm out of time, but if you have more questions, you can talk to me after.